Hello, Internet. It has been a while since I've last made any content here, so it feels really good to be here. And on that note, I've been working on something really exciting for the past couple of weeks, and I feel like it is something that most of the members in the Wiz community would find very helpful for their project. It is a no-code solution for implementing filters and pagination onto your Wiz project. Now, something to keep in mind is that because this is a no-code solution, just like but basically any other no-code setup, this also carries its own set of limitations. That long list of limitations is actually quite short because the only limitations you would have to keep in mind is that you would have to use Xano as your backend. I really haven't had the chance to try it out on any other backends, and the script that we're using here is geared towards Xano. But if you give it a try, test it out with other databases, and if it works, please do let me know. I'd be happy to add that into the documentation and let others know about it as well. And for the second limitation is that you need to have Xano handle all the filters exclusively within the function stack. Now, of course, this is going to make a whole lot more sense once we go through this setup. But yeah, if you think that you're good for both of these pointers here, I think that this solution will fit in very nicely with your project. So that being said, let's jump on to the demo itself. Now, here is the demo at its glory. Now, for some of you, this UI might seem a little familiar, and that's because the whole filtering system plus the UI itself, it has actually been based off of FinSuite's older filtering attribute system. And some of you might remember this clonable, this car filter clonable here. And I mean, this filter is just such a solid system even to this day. So yeah, I based my filtering system off of this as well. Again, so inspired by this, so much so that I also grabbed the content for this and dropped it into our Xano database. Something I have not checked with FinSuite, but fingers crossed, hopefully it is okay with them. All right, so let's try out the filtering here. As you can see, we're currently showing you 50 items of 511 items. Let's quickly check out what the pagination looks like. And we're using a infinite pagination. So if I scroll all the way to the bottom, it fetches the next batch. So I think it fetches the next 50 items. Again, it fetches another 50 items. You can control the frequency of how many items it should fetch every time. That's totally up to you. So yeah, you get the idea of how this works. If I scroll all the way back up and test out all of our filters, see how they work. All right, so we got the search. The search is very simple. So if you don't type out the full word, Xano's not going to provide you with anything. So if I type in Toyota here, it fetches all the cars with that make. So that's the search. Then we have our checkbox. And as you can see with every selection, we have our chips being generated for us that tells us the make, the category of the filter plus the filter itself, which is great. You can also remove a filter selection straight from the chip, which is really cool. You can also sort by as well. So let's say lowest price first, which is great. And then now, if I switch back to FinSuite's example here real quick, I noticed that they had like the range slider, which is something that I really wanted to implement onto this system as well. But I was having some complications with it, and I just switched over to another method of it, and I've decided to use select fields as range sliders. So we have a from range slider and to. So let's say that I want to filter these cards on a price from 10,000 to 45,000. And this is how it gets reflected on your chips. So you have the price to and then the price from. So the same story for mileage as well. So let's say we have 15,000, so around 240,000. And there we go. So we have narrowed it down to 18 cards. All right, so let's select a year as well. Let's go for 2016. So it narrows it down to one card. We also have filters as well that targets only that single category. So let's say I'm going to reset the year here, but and you'll notice that it removes the chip for the year, which is really cool. And maybe I want to narrow it down to field type to these two categories here. And lastly, the location here, which brings us back to these three cards here. And yeah, that is the filtering system. Here is what the Wized. So here's what the Wized setup looks like. If I take you to the actions here, we just have we're using native actions where we just fetch the information from the request and we're dropping it into our various variables. Over here, you'll notice that I have requests. These are various requests that populates our filters here. And this happens at the start of the page load. Apart from that, we're not using any sort of scripts at all. This is completely a script-free setup. All the heavy lifting is done by our custom script that you'll be attaching at the head tag of your page. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to clone this and I'm going to start a fresh new project. I'm going to remove all the attributes. We're going to start from, we're going to start fresh. We're going to cover through all the filters and you'll notice how we get the setup done on the front end and the back end as well. So yeah, let's get right to it. Okay, so we have our brand new project cloned for us. Plus, I went ahead and also cloned in the Wized project. But before we dive into the setup here, let's actually head over to Xano and just have a quick look around as to see what we're dealing with. Now, firstly, starting off with the database tables, you will notice that we only have 4 tables in total. Starting off with the brands, we have all the brands listed here, and the brands table is specifically created to populate our this filter right here that we have, which is for makes. So just so we're clear. And then for the cars table, this is the main filter content. This is where we have all our cars, the brand, the fuel type, year, price, mileage, and everything. Most of them are all self-explanatory, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. One thing you will notice is that in this table, so if I head over to settings, actually, sorry, not settings, indexes here. So you'll notice that I have this option enabled, search, and this is where we apply our search of car search and where we target the car brand. So when we're making a search, we're only targeting this one field, which is a car brand. So I'm not going to spend the time on how this actually works because Xano's already done a really helpful tutorial on this. I'm going to link the tutorial on the description below if you want to check that out, but just thought I'd point that out there. Okay, so that's that for cars. And then if we jump into fuel types, this is the table that populates this filter right here. So if I head over to our Webflow project here, and as you can see, we have this fuel type options here. That's where the content is coming from. So that's fuel type right there. And then we have location. Of course, we have all the locations out here, which is, again, used to populate our filter options for the location filters here. Alrighty, now that we got all the tables out of the way, let's just quickly head over onto our API. And we have 5 API endpoints in total. All of them are, well, most of them are for, making GET requests so that we can grab the options to populate our filters. And then this one here, cars, is the one that we actually make a call to when we want to grab all the filter content. So as you can see, we have a lot of inputs here. Don't worry about what they are right now, because as we start setting up our filters, I'm going to go through each of these inputs and how they correlate with our setup in the function stack as well. So for now, don't worry about what you're seeing here. And for the other API endpoints, these are just simple GET requests. So I'm not going to go through these because they are quite self-explanatory, except for mileage options. We're going to go through the mileage options as we start setting up the mileage range filters. So there's that. But again, for now, this is what we have for our filters. Now over onto Wiz, the first thing that we want to do is go ahead and set up our Xano app. I'm going to do exactly that. Let's select REST. Let's head over to our API filters here. Just grab the endpoint URL. Okay, and we're going to just take that away. All right. Now, what we're going to do is, now that we've created the Xano app instance here, we're going to go ahead and create our very first request, and we're going to call this fetch cars, because if I go to the API endpoint, we want to set up this endpoint here because this is our main endpoint. This is the one that is responsible for setting up all the filter content and receiving the filter messages and filtering our content based off of that. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to call it fetch cars. Let's select Xano as our app. So this is a GET request. For the URL endpoint, we're just going to put it as cars. And that is pretty much it. Let's actually quickly test it out and see if this works. But before we do that, you'll notice that I have a precondition applied. And so right now, I don't think this is going to work, but let's give it a quick test run and see if it does. Okay, so it worked. And as we can see that we've received 25 items and we have 511 items in total. So yeah, this worked. But if I were to publish this, which I haven't, but if I were to publish this now and preview this real quick, actually, there's no way for me to figure this out because like right now to see if we can run this because we don't have anything set up for it. But anyway, that's fine. We got this set up. Now, you'll notice that, of course, the API has a lot of inputs here. We're not going to worry about the inputs right now. We're going to set up the inputs as we set up our filters. So now the next thing that we want to do is let's head over onto our documentation. Now, you'll notice that we have a documentation with our clonable. If you actually scroll down, it tells you a step-by-step instruction of what to do. So to get started, we need to use Wized filter and pagination, the CDN link. So this is the CDN link that we need. So we need to copy that, head over to Webflow, head over to our home page here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to paste this code in here. There we go. And we're just going to go ahead and publish this project. Alrighty, nice. Now that's done. Let's go back to our documentation, see what the next step is. Set up add attribute to the form element that contains the filters. So we have this instruction here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this attribute right here because we need to copy this. And over here is the description. So the Webflow form element that wraps all filters, pagination, and items to be filtered. So if we go back to our Webflow page here, and if we go to the layers panel, the navigator panel here, and if you look at the navigator here, you'll notice that we have this form block. And if you look carefully, we have all our filters, including the chips and the sorting. And then we also have this pagination trigger element, which is responsible for initiating the pagination. These elements are all inside this form filter grid. Because generally when you create a form block, you always have like 3 div blocks. And it's this div block that you need to make sure that you have all your pagination elements, your filter elements, and your chips, your sorting, basically everything needs to be inside this one div block. So you want to select this div block, and then you paste in the attribute that we just copied. And just for safe measure, if you go back to the documentation, you'll notice that it says that we don't actually need to put in a value. So this can just be an attribute with an empty value. So step 1 and step 2 is done. So let's move on to the next step. And what we're going to do is, I'm just going to click away from this. So we're going to start working with our search filter. So the search currently is designed in a way where we actually have this input here that is not styled in. So you want to make sure that the attribute is applied to your input. So this is the input which actually doesn't have any styling on it. So the first thing that you want to do is head over to the documentation again, scroll up and head over to search. Okay, so there we go. So create search filter and its attributes list. So over here, you'll find a table of all the attributes that we need for our search filter. And as you can see that all of these are required. So we're going to start off with the Wized first. All right, so let's apply our Wized element. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply a attribute for this, call it filter search input. There we go. So that is done. Let's go back over here, standard Wized identifier for this element. And then we need another attribute here, Wized filter search variable. So why do we need this? Because it stores the search input value inside the specified Wized variable. Alrighty, so let's do that. So let's copy this attribute and paste this in here. So for the variable, we need to create our own Wized variable where we can store what's being typed into the search input into that Wized variable. So I'm going to call it filter search. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that value and I'm going to jump straight into Wized because we need to create that variable. And right now we don't have that variable. So let's go ahead here and create our variable. Let's paste this in, filter search. And there we go. So now we have our filter search variable. So anything that we type in here should be offloaded into this variable. And our script is going to handle that for us. So we don't have to worry about it. Okay, so that is done. Now let's move on to the next one, which is wfilter request. So let's copy that and fires a Wized request to reload filtered content whenever a user types in the search input. Now, if you remember correctly, we just went ahead and we set up this request here, which is fetch cars. And this request is responsible for loading up all the cards that we're going to see here. So as soon as you start typing something in here, and when you're done, the script is going to take that information and then it's going to offload that into this variable. And then it's going to execute the Wized request of fetch cars. So that's what it's going to do. Now, let's go back here into Webflow, put that in there, Wized filter request. And if we check the documentation, it's asking for the Wized request name that's responsible for this. So in our case, that will be fetch cars. Perfect. So that is done. Now what we're going to do is move on to the final attribute. We're going to copy that. So that is wfilter pagination current variable. So it's kind of a long one, and it ensures pagination resets to page 1 when a search term is entered, must match the correct Wized variable for pagination. So because we have pagination, we actually need to have 2 variables in total. One is the current, the pagination that holds the value of the current page number, and another variable that holds the value of the next page number. But as we start setting up the pagination, this will make a lot more sense as to what we're working with here. But every time, whenever there is a change in value with any filters, we always have to ensure that the pagination current variable, this attribute here, that variable, Wized variable, needs to have its value set to 1 before we execute the Wized filter request. This might sound a little confusing, but as we set this up, this will start to make sense. What I'm going to do now is in Wized, because we need to create a variable for our attribute, I'm going to call this filter pagination current. So this variable here will hold the value of our current page number. Now, just a quickly show you here. This is our fetch cars, and if you remember correctly, we have pagination enabled for our API here. Over here, you see this data path that says current page is 1 because it's showing you the content for, it's loading up all the items that is in page 1. But if you sent it, if you requested for the items that are in page 2, you would change this to page 2. But that's something that our pagination filter is going to achieve. And we'll worry about that later on. Another thing you want to ensure is that you want to set its initial value to 1. By default, it should always be 1. So let me just reload that real quick. Now you'll notice that the pagination current is set to 1, which is perfect. Let's go back here. And, oh, actually, I forgot to copy this. So you want to make sure that it is exactly how you see it here, and because they're case sensitive. And then you want to go back into your documentation, and that's pretty much it. So you have all these 4 attributes. Now, what we're going to do is quickly test to see if this is working. So let's close this. Let's publish our project here. All right, so I had to pause the recording here for a second. I had to double check a few things, and just to show you, I've made some few changes. Now, on the homepage, on the head tag, we only have this one script, and previously we had the Wized embed code here as well, but originally it was supposed to be on the page settings. So I just moved that. Okay, now that we've published the site, before we can actually successfully test this out, I need to go back here, reload the page, and what we're going to do now is we're going to create our first request. I'm going to create a folder, call it requests, and we're going to store all our requests in this folder, and we're going to call this fetch cars request because this is going to be responsible for executing the fetch cars request when the page finishes loading. And what we're going to do is we want this to be only on the home page. Fetch cars. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to open up the data store. We're going to reload the page and make sure that the fetch cars request executes on page load. Okay, perfect. It's done. And now we're going to type in, and just to recap, I'm going to type something in here. It's going to offload that in here. It's going to reset our pagination current value, and then it's going to execute the fetch cars request. There we go. So it grabbed Toyota, it offloaded in here. Our Wized variable got reset to 1, and then it's switched over to, and then it executed the fetch cars request. So it's working. Now, however, we need to attach this variable inside the fetch cars request just to see if we're actually, if this is actually working. So what we're going to do is head over to the fetch cars request, and then we're going to add in our URL parameter. But before we can do that successfully, we need to go here, and we need to look for the search input here. So let's grab search, go to Wized here, and we're just going to drop in our variable here, which is v.filter_search. Let's close that. Let's reload the page one more time. So I'm going to type in Toyota here. Well, actually, this time I'm going to type in Honda, and I want to know if I get all cars that are related to Honda. There we go. So now we have items total, which is 162, and all my items are Honda. We got a second car here, Honda. We got the third car here, Honda. So yeah, our filter is working right out of the box. Before we wrap up on our search input filter real quick, what we're going to do is go into our action here, and we need to create another action, and this is pertaining to our pagination. So we're going to create a new folder, call it variable variables. And we're going to put in all our variable related actions in this folder. So we're going to call this filter pagination current and then set variable. So this is our entire variable name, and then right at the end we state the action, basically our intent on what we want to do with this. So just to double check, filter pagination current, and what exactly we're trying to accomplish here is make sure that whenever the request of fetch car finishes, and because our fetch car has two data path here that contains the value of the current page and also contains the value of the next page. This is very crucial for our pagination setup. Not right now, but something that you want to be aware of. For now, we're just going to work with the current page. Later on, when we start setting up our pagination, we're going to work with the next page later on. So let's make sure that this happens when our request of fetch cars dot status. So when it's successful, only then we want to set this variable, and let's see if it's returning the value. All right, perfect. So that action is done. Let's reload the page real quick. All right, so we have one. Our fetch cars has executed properly. Let's put in Chevrolet here. All right, it's offloaded. Everything is working perfectly. We have received 49 items in total, and all our items are related to Chevrolet. Perfect. And that brings us to the end of the search filter. Oh, but before we actually conclude, let's head off to our API endpoint. Now, because we wrapped up on search, so we have search on the input. Now, let's see what's happening on the function stack here. For the precondition, this is just simply checking if, if these domains are making the call, or if one of these domains are making the call. And because we're working from inside inside Wized, Wized actually uses this origin link here, which is why we're able to make this call. Now, if I were to do it from the published page, the call wouldn't work. So what we're going to do for the sake of this setup right now, I'm just going to disable it for now and publish it. Let's not worry about this at all. And instead go into the query all records here and take a look at our custom query. So we're going to ignore everything, but we're just going to focus on this filter here. So over here, as you can see, that we currently are targeting the cars search from our cars table, and then we're using the operator of search, and then we hook it up to our search input. You want to be mindful that you have the ignore empty values checked. It's because that these values are checked as, because we're also ignoring empty values, that's how we're able to use the same request to get all the cars without any filter values. And if there are filter values, then, our request will make sure that it can accommodate that. But yeah, that itself brings us to the end of the search filter. Next on the filter setup, we have our make options here, which is basically checkbox setup. So yeah, let's go ahead and start off with that. So I'm going to revert back to my documentation here, scroll all the way back up. All right, so we got our checkbox. Okay, now we need to ensure that we have all these attributes and they need to be applied to the main checkbox wrapper. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's copy our Wized variable here. So for this, I'm going to call it filter make checkbox. So we need the Wized attribute because we need to render these checkboxes out. So let's see what we have next. All right, so it's almost similar to search. We have Wized filter checkbox variable. So when we check these checkboxes, all those values are going to be stored inside this variable. So let's copy this and add that to the wrapper here as well. Now we need to create a Wized variable. So what we're going to do is I'm going to call it filter make options. So let's copy that and head over to Wized, create a new variable, filter make options. So whenever I check the checkboxes, all the values will be stored in here. All right, now let's get to our documentation, Wized filter checkbox request. Now, this one is an interesting one. So this is optional. Used only if checkboxes are dynamically loaded. The value should be the name of the Wized request fetching the checkbox options, not required for static checkboxes. Now, in our case, this is not a static checkbox. This is, in fact, a dynamic checkbox. And if you remember correctly, in our database, we have this table right here, which are all the brands, and we want these brands to actually be rendered through a form of checkbox. So we're going to go ahead and add that attribute in. Now, because now we need to put in the name of the request that is responsible for fetching these options, but we don't actually have that ready in Wiz. So we're going to do exactly that. I'm going to create a new request, but before I do that, I'm going to create a folder and call it filters, save that. And then I'm going to call it fetch brands, because this will be responsible for fetching all the brands. This is going to be a GET request. And let me just check the API real quick. Okay, so it is brands. Let's see if this works. Okay, it's grabbing all the brands. Perfect. Now, what we want to do is head over to action. And I'm going to go ahead, create a new folder. I'm going to call it, actually, no, we're not going to create a new folder. We're just going to put it in the same folder that we have, which is requests. And this one is going to be fetch brands request. So we want to execute this when the page finishes loading, and we want this to happen only inside the home page. There we go. So fetch brands. Perfect. And we're going to revert back to Webflow, and we're going to say fetch brands is the request name that we need to wait. So this tells the script that, hey, this is a dynamic checkbox, and we need to wait for this request here. Once this is finished, our script will do its thing. Okay, now let's head over to the documentation. Now we have Wized filter checkbox category. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's copy this and try to understand what this is. Groups checkboxes together, essential for chips filters and for targeting specific checkbox groups when using the reset feature. So we're using this attribute for two reasons. So if I go back to Webflow, you'll notice that we have this reset button here, which we don't have an attribute for, but this reset button needs a checkbox group to target. So that's why we need to add this attribute. And secondly, we also have the chips here. So when we select these options, we want the chips to also recognize which category these selected options are coming from. So let's go ahead and add that in. Wized filter checkbox category. Now, if you look at the documentation, it says unique identifier. So you can put in whatever you want. For us, because the category here is called makes. So I'm just going to call it make. There we go. That's done. let's go ahead and copy this. Wized filter pagination current variable. Just like the search, this is the same as well. We just need to put in the variable name of the pagination current value, which is this one right here. Make sure you copy that. And hit over here and Wized filter request, just like the search filter. This also does the same thing. Let's go ahead, put that in there. And I believe the request is called fetch cars. And that's it. That is all we need to do for our checkbox. So I'm going to go ahead and publish this. So now that's published, we're going to go head over to Wized here. We're going to reload this page. Okay, so we got fetch cars and fetch brands coming in. But now what we need to do is we need to actually render out all our checkboxes. Now, one thing that I've completely forgotten to include into the documentation is that for when you're setting up the attributes for your checkbox, you also need to target the checkbox label. And it's really important to do that, which is something that I've completely forgotten to include. All right, so you need to make sure to add the attribute of wfilter-checkbox-label. You don't need a value for this. However, we do need to make, we need to add the Wized attribute in there. So let me just check the checkbox wrapper here. So we have filter make checkbox. So for the checkbox label, we're going to put in filter make label. So this is so that we can render our checkbox. Now, the reason why we're including the additional attribute for the label is so that when you're selecting the checkbox filters, our script grabs the label and then it puts it into the Wized variable, which is something that we're going to see right now. Okay. All right. So let's click onto the X-ray here. All right. So this was something that I was previously working on before. So, which is why you're seeing this. Let's go ahead, click on the checkbox here and render this out. Let's reload this one more time. Okay. All right. So I was previously off when I was recording. I was going through with this. But yeah, I've already went ahead and set up the rendering for the text. So that is great. We're going to select BMW. And as you can see that this is now working. Our selected option is there. Now we want to make sure to click on clear here and see if that works. Okay, so we need to attach the reset attribute here. Completely forgot about that. So if I go into my documentation here and scroll all the way back up. All right, so it's this one right here. So create single reset for filter category and its attribute list. So we want to target the clear link, the link block. Just grab this. And for the value, same value as the wfilter filter type category attribute. So in case if that doesn't make sense, what you want to do is click on the link block here or any element, doesn't matter. And for the value here, you need to put in the same value that you put into the attribute into the category attribute, which is basically this one here. So wfilter checkbox category make. So you want to click here. You want to put in this right here. Put in make. So yeah, there we go. And we're going to go ahead and publish it. So this time you'll notice that our reset is also going to work. Let's reload this one more time. And there we go. Just like that, our checkbox is ready. Now, what I'm going to do is, because if we scroll down here, we also have fuel type, which is dynamically rendered out and is the same exact setup as makes. So I'm going to skip setting this up and I'm going to set this up off screen. But for now, another thing I actually wanted to show you guys is how I would go about creating a static version of this filter. So let's say that I have this div block here, filter group wrapper. Let me just copy this so that now I have another one, and let's just call it tutorial demo. And let's just pretend that this group of checkbox is completely static and it's not dynamic. So what we want to do is we want to select the checkbox main wrapper, and because this is static, we don't really require a Wized attribute, firstly. And secondly, we also don't need a WFilter checkbox request. So you can remove this filter. And then after that, we want to make sure that for the WFilter checkbox category, we call it something else. So I would say tutorial checkbox. You can put a like you can call it tutorial checkbox. Now, because you've changed the category, we also want to make sure that the reset button here has the same value. There you go. And then let's change the label to something else. Option A. Oh, I forgot to make one more modification actually. So let me select this checkbox wrapper. And we also need to change the checkbox variable because this is a different variable. So I'm going to call this filter tutorial options. Let's copy this and change it for the rest as well. So what's going to happen now is if I select any of these options from my static checkbox, it's going to grab the value from my label here, and it's going to put that into that Wized variable. Also, we need to go ahead and create this variable in Wized. So let's do that. So if I reload the page, let's check if, okay, so Webflow is published. Oh, right, I need to go ahead and change this because we don't need the Wized attribute for our checkboxes here. That's because these are static options, so we don't need to render these out. So I'll have to publish this again. All right, perfect. So let's go ahead. And there we go. So if I select this now, filter tutorial options isn't loading up. Why is that? All right, let's check it out. I wonder if it's because it needs a Wized value. Wized tutorial, let's call it checkbox. All right, so now you get to see me experiment my own work. I'm not sure if this is going to work, but let's see. I think it's probably because I removed the Wized attribute. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so it's because I removed the Wized attribute, which I shouldn't have done. So yeah. So yeah, there you go. That was the issue. So if you add the Wized attribute back, and if you keep in mind all the other changes that I've made, you should be good. Okay, so as you notice that the options are getting filled in here, our fetch cars is also getting executed. And you'll notice that the pagination current is also being set, which is good. So everything is working properly, and now you know how to set up the both static and dynamic version of the checkbox filter. Now, lastly, if we go on to our cars filters, the request here. Now, because we just wrapped up on setting up make and fuel type, you'll notice that both of these inputs have been set to JSON. That's because we have an array of strings, which is why we need to set these as JSON, something to keep in mind. And if I click into the query all records here and head into the custom query, so if you look at the very first filter here, we're targeting the column of car brand, which contains all the car brands, and we're using the operator of in, and then we target our make input here. So essentially, we're just telling Xano that, hey, all the brands that are in this column, so whatever matches the make input, we want to grab those records. Again, make sure that you also don't forget to check this box here. And scrolling down, we have the cars.fuel type. We're using the operator of in, and again, we're using fuel type as our input here. So whatever fuel type options we have from the database and whatever matches up with the input, we want to grab those records. And that's that for the setup that we have for our checkbox. Hopefully that makes sense. And that being said, if we go back into Wized, we can finally get started with our select range. And for select range, we actually have two different types. We actually have a static, which is this first one. So we have a static filter, and we have the dynamic filter. Right now, you'll notice that we don't have these options rendering up for us. So we're going to go ahead and start setting these up. Back onto our Webflow project, let's double click into our price filters. Let's stretch this navigator panel out a little bit. Okay, now if with the first select field selected, you'll notice that we have all our prices listed out here, which is great because this is a static filter. If I click into it, you'll notice that the value is in numerical value. That's because this is a numerical value, and obviously we need to make sure that it stays that way. And yeah, that's the same for all the others as well. We have the price from, and for the price to, it's the same exact thing as well. Setup is pretty much the same. So what we're going to do is head over onto our documentation, and I'm already on the select range. Okay, so let's see what we have to do here. So let's start copying all these down. So first we need to apply a Wized attribute. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to call this filter price select from. Perfect. And then let's go ahead, and this is the W filter select range from variable. So by now you should know what this essentially does. And we're going to call this filter price from. So that's the variable that we're going to store the information in. So what we're going to do is copy that and quickly go into Wized and create that variable while we can. There we go. It's done. Let's hop on to our documentation, copy this. Okay, so this is the W filter select range category. So we have to put in the name for this. And this is going to be simple. We're just going to call it price. That's it. And let's hop onto the documentation again. W filter request. So this is the request that we need to execute once someone has selected an option. Let me scroll down a little bit here. And this is going to be fetch cars. Let's go to the documentation again. Select the select range request. Oh, right. So over here, the select range request, we don't need this. That's because this is a static select range filter. So we're not dynamically loading anything up. So I should also update this to optional. This is not required. So what we're going to do is move on to the next thing and fill that out. And that's the variable for the pagination variable that we have. Let's copy that because I forgot about it for a second. And there we go. That's done. Let's go ahead and set up the attributes for our price to. So if we go back to the documentation again, scrolling down, you'll notice that everything is the same. The only difference is instead of from, some of the attributes have the word to, and I think it's just this one only. So let's go ahead and set this up as well. So let's call this filter select. Oh, filter price select to. Now let's move on to the next one. Select range to variable. So this is the variable that we need to store the option into. So we're going to call this filter price 2. So let's copy that. Go back into Wized, create another variable, paste that in there. So we have price from and price to right here, which is great. Jump back into Webflow. Actually, go back into the documentation, copy this, which is the category. It's going to be price. Let's add another one. Okay, so the Wized filter request. This is going to be fetch cars. Okay, so we don't need this. Let's go into this one with filter pagination. I forgot the pagination variable name again. All right, perfect. Now, lastly, I think it's the reset button that's left for us. So let's go back to the documentation, scroll all the way down. And because we're working with select range reset, so it's this attribute right here, wfilter select range reset. So let's add that attribute in there. And for the value, it has to be the same value that we used for the category attribute. So if I click into this select field here, and if I just click into this and copy the price value here and paste the price in there, and there we go. And our entire filter for the select range price is done. So let's go ahead and set this up. All right, now let's reload this. So as soon as I've selected the option, you'll notice that our value is printed onto the variable here. Now, if I select this here, 65, instead of the string, it's the value that's being printed onto the variable. Now, what we want to do is we want to head over to our fetch cars, and we want to add in the from and the to value. But before we do that, we actually need to check. Okay, so we have price from and price to, and as you can see that the inputs are set to integer. So whenever you're working with range, you can only work between numericals or date. That's it. So in our case, it's numerical. So that's why we're using two integer inputs. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So we have price underscores from, and then we have another one, price underscores to. There we go. Now let's look at our fetch cars here for a second and see if it's all working properly. So if I select, before I select anything, we're pulling in 511 records. Let's see if this changes anything. So if I select 20,000, there we go. We're pulling in 61. And if I go to 35, and it's down to 19. So yeah, our filter is working. That's great. Now let's try resetting this. And there we go. It's reset, and our fetch cars has been reset as well. And we're grabbing 511 items, which is amazing. I'm going to go ahead and I will start setting up all the attributes for the mileage, because this is our dynamic request, and setup wise, it's exactly the same as our static filters. The only difference is we just need to add one more attribute that tells our script that, hey, this is a dynamic filter. So we need to load up all the options from that request. Okay, so I went ahead and now I have attached all the attributes that we need to attach to both the from and the to select fields that we have for our range filter. So these are the two filters that we have. And like I said, they're completely the same as we've set for price from and price to. The only difference is that we had to add an additional attribute here, which allows the script to know that the script has to wait for this Wized request to finish executing, and then and basically initialize the listeners onto these two filters. And then on top of that, what I've done is I have created the request for it as well. So, which is basically getting a get request from our mileage options. So if I show you what that looks like. So there we go. So we have the fetch mileage, which is loading up on page load. And essentially it brings back all the options that we need to populate for both mileage from and mileage to. Keep in mind that for mileage from and mileage to, the options are exactly the same. So we're returning all the options. And then if you scroll down a little further, we have the values as well. And because this is a select field, we want to bring separate values for the option and a separate value for the values. And then the script, based off of the order of the option and the values, it starts pairing it together. So that's how essentially the script works. Now what we're going to do is head over back to Webflow filters. And this is where the interesting part happens. Now over here, something that we didn't work with on the price from and the price to is that because these two are dynamic filters, we actually, if you look at the navigator panel here, you'll notice that there's a div block, which is actually hidden away. And this is called a select option wrapper. For you, this could be something else. The class doesn't matter. You can apply any class to it you want to. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove my hidden class wrapper here. So you'll notice that over here we have, actually, I'm going to change this to flex, and I'm going to apply, I think, about 4 pixel worth of spacing. Okay, so we have 2 text blocks here, option text and value text. And what we want to do is we want to render out all the options and we want to render out all the values. And then what our script is going to do, it's going to grab all the option text and then pair it up with the appropriate value text. And then it's going to insert that into our mileage from select input. Now there are a few critical things you have to keep in mind is that because we're dynamically loading the options up and because our script is handling all that, you need to ensure that the select option wrapper is nested close to the select field right here. And if I select on the wrapper here, you'll notice that we've applied the following attributes here. So you need to use this attribute, which dictates that this is the wrapper, and it's called wfilter select range from option. So this is the wrapper for the from filter. And then you have the wfilter select range category because you also want to target the appropriate category. And in this case, we have wfilter select range category and the value is mileage. Again, it works just like the reset concept. So it's called mileage because if I select on the select range input here and check out the value for this attribute, which is wfilter select range category, which is also mileage. So that's how that's how our script will know that these options and values are targeted for this specific select field. Hopefully that makes sense. What I'm going to do is I'm also going to take away the hidden combo class for this as well. So it's easier. And I believe that both of these label texts here, these text elements, also have their own attributes. So we have wfilter select range from option, and then it has the value of option text. And then the same for value as well. We have the from value, and it's the value text. And then we also have a Wized attribute for it so that we can render this out inside of Wized. Again, for all this, you would just simply have to copy these attributes right here. So dynamically loading select range filters, just follow the instructions here. And of course, you can also follow the tutorial like you're doing right now. So hopefully this all makes sense. So let's go back into our project. And what we're going to do is we'll publish this. And we're going to head over to Wized, reload this real quick. It seems like our Wized is not working. So I'm going to rescan the attributes. There we go. So we're going to select the select option from, and we're going to render this out first. So let's do that. Let's open up the data store. Okay, so this is for the option text. So we are targeting our fetch mileage data. So this one right here, mileage options. We don't want the value for this. We want the options. Fetch mileage dot data dot mileage options. Okay, there we go. That is good. And then for the text, we want to have, actually, let's copy this. And for the options, so that itself should be good. Okay, so we have all our options rendering out, which is great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that and then head over to, let's switch off the X-ray here for a second. Okay, and now for this one, instead of options, this is going to be values, because if I scroll down here, it's the one over here. So we want to render it out from this array. And actually, let me copy that. And we want to render this out. Okay. Now if I reload this, so if I open up my select field, you'll notice that all my options are popping up. So yeah, that's a lot of options right there. So now, with that being said, I'm going to do the same for the mileage 2 as well. Just basically repeat the whole thing. So if I just reload this page, I have the options for both mileage from and mileage 2 rendered out. It's not just the options, but we have the options and the values that we need loading up. I also went ahead and I've created the 2 variables that we need. So one is going to store the from value and the other one is going to store the to value. So just to show you that this is working, if I scroll up here, if I select 30,000, instead of the string, it's storing the value. So that's the whole purpose of using this. So if I use 95,000, there we go. And let's try resetting it real quick. Okay, so the reset's not working, and that's probably because I forgot to apply the attribute for it. So if I scroll all the way down, because we're working with select range, so let's select this attribute here, head over to Webflow, and select this. And because our category is called mileage, so we're going to use mileage. And then on top of that, because you've got a good idea of what this wrapper does, we're just going to go ahead and hide it. Let's publish that. Now, whilst that is publishing, what we're going to do is okay, so that's published. We're going to jump back into Wized, and we're going to go back to our request, and then we're going to plug the mileage of attributes, the mileage parameters into our fetch cars request here. But before we do that, we actually need to go back into our API. So we have mileage from and mileage to. So let's do that. Mileage from, we're going to use the mileage from variable here. And then we're going to use the mileage to. Okay, there we go. Now, if we just reload this page, our reset should be working and our filtering should be working as well. So let's take a look at our fetch cars. Okay, so currently we have 511 items. That's great. Let's select 20,000 here. Okay, so it's gone down to 404 and our variable is being updated. So everything's working. Now, instead of 404 items, let's see if we can take it down further. All right, so it's gone down 181. So yeah, it's working. Now let's try our reset value, and there we go. It has reset both these filters, and our fetch cars is grabbing 511 items. And just like that, we have set up both our static version of the select range and the dynamic version of select range filter. Now, the last thing on the agenda for the select range filters is I just need to quickly walk you through how we've set this up on the query, all records here. So if I open this up, all right, so we have the price to and the price from, and it's quite simple. Because we have integer values. When you're using integer values, it's just a matter of using the less than and more than operators. So we're targeting the column of price inside the cars table, and we're just taking the value from there, and then anything that's less than or equals to the price to value, and then we do the opposite for the price from value. Hopefully that makes sense. It's the same thing for the mileage as well. If you were using a date field, it would have the option would have been a little bit different because you would have to use this specific filter. Now I know that we're not using this filter, but I will tag the appropriate tutorial because Xano's done an amazing tutorial on this. I think you should check that out. But yeah, so that's the filter setup for here. And let's also head into the mileage options here. So we've applied a lot of filters here. I'm not going to walk you through on how we did this. It's not really part of the tutorial, but the main thing, but the main takeaway from this is that we actually have these filters that ensures that we grab the options and the values separately. Now, back onto our Wized setup here, I went ahead and I've already set up our year filter. So just to give you a little preview, this is the variable that we have, filter year option. And because our filter the year filter is static, this setup is exactly the same as select range, but we're going to review this as well. Let's say I select 2014 and it selects 2014. And if I go over to fetch cars here, scroll down, we receive 16 items in total, and it brings back the records that matches the query, which is amazing. So let's reset that. Now, if I head over to Webflow, click into it. Now, because this is a static filter, we don't have a separate hidden option wrapper like we saw for the select range. Instead, we have all our years laid out. And because this is a select range, whether the value is numerical or a string, it doesn't really matter because you can only have a single value. So these are all the attributes that you need to apply. So of course we have the Wized attribute, but in this sense, this is absolutely useless, because you're not really doing anything with this Wized attribute. And then we have the Wized wfilter select variable. So this is the variable, the Wized variable that you need to put in that will store the selection. And then we have the Wized wfilter select category, which is set to year. This is used for our reset and our chip option. And then we have the wfilter pagination current variable, which has the variable for the pagination current variable. And then we have the Wized filter request, the Wized request, which it executes after we've selected something. Now, this is the setup that we have for our static filter. Now, let's say that, if we had a dynamic filter, how do we go ahead and set this up? So what we're going to do is I'm just going to select this and I'm going to call this make demo. No, make tutorial. So over here, what we're going to do, we're going to leave everything as is, but obviously we need to add in one additional attribute. So we're going to head over to the documentation, and these are all the attributes that we have for the select filter. We're going to go ahead and add this one here, Wized filter select request. So that tells our script that this is the filter. Sorry, this is the request that we need to wait for. And what we're going to do is we're going to have, so see, notice all the filters that we have, the options that we have for make. We're going to use the same request and populate it over here. So I can show you how the dynamic setup is done. For that, what I'm going to do is go to fetch brands, copy this, because I believe that that's the same request that fetches the make options, and that's it. Once we have done that, what we're going to do is we have our select filter here. So I'm going to select the parent element here, and then I'm going to create an div block here. Okay, so I'm going to use this select option wrapper, and I'm going to insert 2 text block in here. So we have 2 text block. Now, if I select the option wrapper, because we need to add in an attribute for it. So if your select filter needs to dynamically load options, follow these additional steps. So for the option wrapper, you need to put in these 2 attributes here. So let's copy this attribute first. Well, actually, sorry, this attribute first needs to have the same value as the select filter that this div belongs to. So let's, with the option wrapper selected, and because we are targeting this wrapper here, actually, which reminds me, we actually need to make a few changes here. So let's call this filter make select. So we're changing the attribute here. Let's change this as well. We're going to call it option select option. For the category, I'm going to call it make 2. That's because we already have a category that has make, so you have to be very careful about this. This can stay the same, this can stay the same, this can, okay, so this is new. And for the reset here, I'm going to change this to make 2. And then for the wrapper here, I'm also going to put this as make 2. There we go. That is done. And then we have the W filter select option with the value of wrapper. That's perfect. So let's do that. So this tells our script that this is the wrapper that we need to grab the options from. Oh, and for the year here, for the select input here, let's remove all these options because this is a dynamic filter and we need to have at least one option available. So let's select a brand. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Now, one of the text elements in the div block will need to have the following attributes. So we have 2 sets of attributes that we need to apply for the option and the other one for the values. So let's do exactly that. Okay, so let's apply the Wized attribute filter make select option. So this is option text with the value. Let's be wary of that. Okay, done. Let's apply the Wized attribute for this as well. And instead of option, we're going to say select value. This one is going to say value text. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is publish this. Now, whilst that is publishing, let's go ahead and create this variable here on Wized so that this works. Okay, so that's our make select option. We already have the make options for our checkbox here. So let's go ahead, rescan all our attributes. And there we go. Okay. Now what we're going to do is let's switch the X-ray on, select that, and let's render this out. To grab it from fetch brands. So that's the request that we need to render this out from. And then we need to also render out the text. Okay, so that is done. Let's actually copy this. And then for the select value, let's actually paste this in here and also render this out. Okay, let's switch off X-ray and reload this. Okay, so there we go. Now we have all our select options here. And if I click into it, we should have our option showing up here. Now, keep in mind that this is basically the value text here, not the option text. So the option is what we see on the UI, but inside the variable, we're actually storing the value. So yeah, that's how you would go ahead and set up the dynamic select filter. Let's see if we can clear this off. Perfect. It's working here. Now, another thing we want to test is let's make sure that when we select an option here, we want to see if the fetch cars is being executed. All right. So, of course, this is not going to affect the actual results here because we haven't connected this to our request, which is something you would do once you're done with the setup. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense. And that being said, that brings us to a wrap onto the select filter, and we can finally wrap up with the location. Okay, so we are now back onto our Webflow and going to start setting up our radio filter. Okay, so let's hop onto our documentation, and here are all the attributes that we need to apply for our radio select. So let's go through these one by one. We have the Wized attribute first, pretty self-explanatory by now. So we need this, and we need to apply this to our. Now, before we apply the attribute, just to point this out, on the navigator panel, we have the radio select and then the radio label. So we need to apply all the attributes to the parent element. Again, it doesn't matter what class you have. It can be any class, but it has to be applied to the parent element. All right, so let's apply that, and we're going to call it filter location radio. All right, so that's the first one done. Let's grab the wfilter radio variable. That's where we're going to store the value of the selected radio filter that we have. So I'm going to call this filter location option. Actually, let's copy that and create the variable inside of Wized. Let me just reload the page. All right, that's done. Let's hop onto the documentation here. wfilter radio request. Okay. Now, we don't have the value for this. That's because we need to set up the request for this. And what I'm going to do is hop on to Wized, go here, and then I'm going to grab one of these requests here duplicate it, and I'm going to call it fetch location. That's what we're going to call it. And we're going to hop onto our Xano API here. And so it's called location. So if I click into it, yeah, it's called location. I'm going to copy that. Get over onto Wized and replace this. Once that's done, let's just quickly test it to see if it's working, and it is working. Amazing. All right, so let's copy that, jump onto Webflow, and paste that in there. Perfect. So let's jump onto our documentation again. So WFilter radio category. So we need to come up with a unique name for this, and we're going to call it location. All right, let's move on to the next one. The last two attributes are something that we've been applying for all the other filters as well. Let's grab that as well. We're going to call this fetch cars. And for the current variable, I just need to go and grab this variable. And there we go. So that's done. Oh, actually, we need to also set up the filter radio. Okay, yeah, it's already done for us. So we have WFilter radio reset, and it's targeting location. Okay, perfect. Now let's go ahead and publish this. Now let's head over onto Wized, reload this. And what we're going to do now is onto our actions panel here, we are going to go and duplicate one of these actions, and we're going to call this fetch location request. And we're going to switch this to fetch location. So let's open up the data store here. If I can find my location. Okay. So let's just reload this page and make sure that this is loading up. Okay, this is loading up. Perfect. Now we want to switch on the X-ray. Oh, one thing I completely forgot, and I also did the same thing with our checkbox. And if I hop onto our Webflow setup here, we need to apply the attribute for the label here. So let's do that. All right, let's go, and we need WFilter radio label, no value needed. Okay, and then we need a Wized attribute. Let me actually see what was the attribute I used for the parent one. Okay, so let's copy that. And over here, instead of radio, we're going to change this to label, so it stays more consistent that way. Okay, let's publish that one more time. Let's head over onto Wized, rescan our attributes, and now we just need to render out our, let's start off with the the radio filter first. Select index, list value of R, fetch location dot data, and for the label, so it is dot location. Alrighty, so let's switch off our X-ray and reload the page, and there we go. Just like that, all our checkboxes are now loading up. Now, the first test we want to ensure is which one? Okay, so that's the checkbox variable that we have.
Put it on the thing.
All right, so this is working. And every time I select an option, our fetch cars is being fired off. However, we now need to connect this variable to our request. So let's do that. So let's create our parameter here. Now, I believe it has the key, the input is location, but we're going to double check it. Okay, so it is location, and it's just a text input. So there we go. Seems like it's not being picked up here. Okay, let's open up the data manager. Filter location option. There we go. All right. Now let's reload this page one more time and select this. Okay. It's working, I think. Let's see. Yep. Items total 7. So we're fetching 7 records that matches this location. What about this one here? What about California here? Okay. Wow, that's a lot of items. Let's reset that. And there we go. 511 records. And just like that, we have set up our dynamic radio. Now, let me show you how we can go ahead and we can also create a static version of the radio. So I'm going to copy this entire thing here and let's select the wrapper here. Now we're going to make a few changes here. So let's call it, just call it location radio 2. And for the radio variable, we're going to call it option 2. Okay, so because this is going to be static, we don't need this attribute. So we can throw this attribute away. And then we'll change the category to location 2. Current variable stays the same. Request fetch car stays the same. And okay, this one can be also 2. So we just need to change that. And then for the reset, let's change this to location 2 so that this is a different group. Let's actually, before we publish that, now what we need to do, we just need to manually create our filters here. Could be option 2. This could be option 3, option 4, option 5, and yep, I think that itself should work. And before we hit publish, let's just grab this because we need to create the variable on Wized just so that we can see if this is working. Let's go and reload the page. Okay, now let's create our variable here. Let's reload the page one more time. Let's hope we didn't mess anything up. And there we go. It's working. So we have all our static options being offloaded into our newly created variable. If we select any options here, perfect, it's being offloaded here. That's great. So if I clear this, it only clears this. And if I clear this, it clears this group right here. So now you know how to create both static and a dynamic version of the radio filters. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. But yeah, now next on the list, we have the chip setup. I do have the chips set up on the documentation pulled up, and it's actually quite simple. So we just need to apply 3 attributes in total. So let's do that. Okay, so we have wfilter chip with the value of chip, wfilter chip with the value of label, and again, the same attribute with the value of remove. I already know this by heart, so let me just get straight to it. So we're on, so the way we've set up the filters for the chip basically is we have this div block here, and you can have as many, chips in it you like. So you want to make sure that you select the chip element, which is the filter tag here. Again, class wise, you can use any class that you like. So I'm going to put this here and going to apply the attribute of chip. And then we have the label here. As you can see, it's already there. That's perfect. And then if I have the remove, okay, so it's already there as well, which is perfect. So we have the remove element, which is a link block. And then we have the label element, and then we have the chip element. Now, you don't have to worry about hiding the chip because this is already handled by the script. So let's go ahead and reload this page. Sorry, publish the site. And Now we just need to reload our page over on Wized, and this should work right out of the box. So as you can see, the chip is now gone. So when I select my filters here, it shows up. Now, one thing that you might notice is whenever we're selecting an option, it grabs the name of the category, and then it displays the name of the option that's selected. In case if you're wondering where it's grabbing the category name from, it's grabbing it from this filter, this attribute that we have on every filter, and that is this one right here, wfilter checkbox category. So all the category attributes contains this value here, make. So if you change this to something else, that's going to be reflected on the chip. But something to also keep in mind is that this attribute is used by two things. It's used by chips and it's used by your reset as well. So yeah, something to be mindful about. And we have the same thing applied across all other filters. So yeah, just like that, we have our chips working. Let's select a few more other chips as well. There you go. Now, if you remove one chip here, you'll notice that the year has been reset. If I remove Chevrolet here, it unchecks that checkbox. If I select BMW, it unchecks that checkbox. So let's actually reload the page one more time and see if it's actually working. So let's select BMW, and we've received 5 records in total. That's perfect. If I remove it from here, there we go. We are receiving 511 items again, which is amazing. Now that the chip setup is done, what we're going to do is we're going to set the central reset button. We're almost close to the finish here. So actually, if I just scroll all the way down here, okay. So it's this one right here, create reset all and its attribute list. So let's grab this and head over. wfilter reset. Okay, so we need to copy this value here, main reset. Okay, so that's done. Then wfilter request. So fires a Wized request to reload filtered content whenever a user clicks on it. So that means we need to fire this off when someone clicks on this reset link. So that would be fetch cars. And then finally, we have to use our Wized pagination current variable again. So let me just grab that value from here, because I keep forgetting that. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and publish that. Let's head over to Wized. So I noticed this option here. Let's go ahead and remove that because that was just something that we were playing around with. All right, so let's go ahead and reload our Wized here. Alrighty, now let's select these two options here. Let's select price range as well. Let's select mileage range here as well. Let's select, well, let's just skip the year. Okay. So we've selected all these chips here, and let's take a look at our fetch cars. So we're currently pulling in 4 items. So let's see what happens when we click on reset. There you go. And as soon as we've hit reset, it reset the whole thing. Now let's take a look at our options here, which is great. All of these are removed. That's perfect. So we have finally set up our chips and our reset all function. So next on the list now, we have setting up our sort filter. And what we're going to do is we're going to copy the first attribute here, head into our Webflow project, select the sort filter, and start applying our attributes. So let's call this sort select. Let's grab this second one here. So this is for storing our sort value inside this Wized variable. By now, I think this should all make sense. So this is with wfilter request. So this is the request that we want to fire off when we have selected an option. Actually, before we continue, let's copy this and head over onto Wized. Let's create the variable. All right, so variable is done. Let's move on to the pagination current variable. By now, this should make sense what this is. And all right, so let's head on to the documentation and then sort category. And for this value, we're going to call it sort. Now, few key things to keep in mind is that for the sort filter, things are a little bit different. The first thing that you need to keep in mind is that sort only works for static setup. You cannot have dynamic setup with the sort filter. The second thing is that you'll notice that most of our filters have a reset button accompanied with them. But, the reset functionality doesn't really work with the sort. It doesn't really work with the chips. It doesn't work with the select as well. So these are the three filters that you don't have independent reset filters, independent reset functionality. So that's the first thing that you want to keep in mind. The second thing is that if you look at the navigator panel here, you'll notice that there's firstly, the sort filter doesn't have any options in it. And that's absolutely fine. Even though it's static, it doesn't have any option in it. That's because all our options are inside this hidden div block here. So if I click on the option wrapper here, it doesn't have any, it doesn't seem to have any attribute on it. Let me double check if that is correct. Okay, so we do need to put that attribute in there, which I actually forgot to do that. So let's do exactly that. We need to call it wrapper. And then let's see what else. Okay, so wfilter sort category. So this needs to be the same as this value here. So let's copy that. Okay, perfect. So now our hidden wrapper has these attributes that we need. Now let's remove our combo class here. Now over here, you will see all these text elements. These are the text elements that we want to be rendered inside our sort filter. So, you can set the text anything you like. However, the magic is in the attributes that we apply to these texts. So let's say for name over here, this is set into an ascending order. So we have like these three attributes, and we have wfilter sort option text. So this is the option text. And then we have this other attribute that where we declare that this is the sort, how we're sorting this and what's the order by, and that's the ascending. And then we have the sort by name. So these are basically targeting the column names that you have inside your Xano table. So the sort by needs to have the name of the column that you have in your database table. So if I go back into our Xano database, go into cars. So when you apply your sort, you want to make sure that this matches the column name of what you have in your table, so that it gets easier for Xano to recognize which column you want to apply the sort filter to. So let me just recap that again. So we have the sort option. This is the option text. And then we have the order by. So this can only have one of two values. This can be either ascending or descending. So if it's descending, then you have to set it to DESC. You should not put any unique values here. This should only be ascending or descending. That's it. And for the sort by, this needs to contain the name of the column. That is it. Once you're done, just hide this away by applying your combo class. And like I said, this is not a dynamic filter. So I'm going to go ahead and publish this. That is done. We are going to reload our page here. Okay, so we have our sort option right here. Let's click in and there we go. We have all our options coming in, and these are coming in from our hidden wrapper. However, now I want you to keep an eye on this variable here. The way that we grab the value is a little different. So if I select lowest mileage, you'll notice that it has an object inside an array. So it's order by ascending and sort by mileage. So it's going to send this to Xano, and then Xano is going to arrange that accordingly. But of course, right now, we didn't actually set this up on our request. So we need to go to fetch cars and then add, well, before we add that, we actually need to go into our cars API. And yeah, there we go. We have sort, which is a JSON field. So you have to keep in mind that for the sort, it always has to be a JSON input. So let's go on to our filter, call this sort, and then target our filter sort options. And let's check this. Okay, perfect. Now, let's reload this. Obviously, I haven't set up the cards yet. So what I'm going to do is once, now that this is working, I'm actually going to go and render the cards. Okay, so I've gone ahead and I've set up all the cards that we have here, and it's rendering nicely. So just to give you an idea, let's say if I select Chevrolet, we have all our data loading up here. Of course, the pagination still doesn't work, so we need to set that up. But everything is happening really fast. So yeah, really, really good stuff here. Now we can finally test out, we'll set up our pagination and test out the entire thing. So let's head over onto our documentation. And so here is our attributes table for the pagination. Let's grab the first one. And then what we want to do is head over to Webflow and scroll down here. Now we have this invisible div here. So if you click into it, we don't have anything inside this div. It's just a blank div, and I've applied a height to it. You don't necessarily have to do that. You just need to apply these attributes to an empty div block. You can have any classes applied to it. So let's go ahead and apply our first variable. Okay, so we have wfilter pagination trigger. Let's check our documentation. No value needed. Okay, that's perfect. Then we have wfilter pagination request. Now let's check this out real quick. The name of the Wized request that initializes pagination. Pagination only begins after this request successfully executes. Now this is extremely crucial to understand what this does, because when we reload our page, out of all the requests, fetch cars is the request that is solely responsible for rendering out the initial batch of our cards, well, our filter content. So we want to ensure that our filter, our pagination only runs after fetch cars has been successful. Otherwise, this should not run at all. So let's go back to Webflow and add in our second attribute. And this is going to be fetch cars. Perfect. So let's go back on to our documentation. wfilter pagination current variable. This is very easy. We already know what that means. We just have to put in the variable of the current page number. So, which is this variable right here. Perfect. And let's go back to our documentation. Now we have another one here, wfilter pagination next variable. Now this one is a bit of an exciting attribute here. So we need to create another Wized variable that holds the value of the next page value. So let's do exactly that. I'm going to copy that. And let's create another variable. And instead of current, we're going to say next. And then we are going to copy that and paste it in here. And there we go. That is done. Okay. And then we have W filter request. So this is quite self-explanatory. So W filter request. Now over here, this is going to be the request where this is the request that the pagination is going to use to grab the next batch of items. For now, we're just going to leave it blank. That's because we don't have that prepared. And before we can create that request, there are several other things that we need to do on the list. So let's go back to our documentation. And then we have this here, wfilter result variable. Let's copy that as well. We're going to leave this empty. Actually, no, hold on. Let me just check what this is. The variable that stores the entire data set being filtered and paginated. This variable gets updated as new data is fetched. Okay. So one thing that I have not mentioned yet is I went ahead and I've created this variable here called filter result. And this is a variable that will store all the data that you're currently seeing here, which is basically the cards here. So when our request of fetch cards is executed, we just offload that entire data onto this variable here. So we just need to simply copy the name of this variable and we need to put that in here. So this tells our pagination that, hey, when we grab a new batch of items, we want to push those items into this variable. So that's how the pagination really works. So, all right, that is done. And then we have wfilter result data path. Now, this is something that we can't provide the value for right away. So for now, we're just going to leave this blank and we're going to circle back to it in just a bit. All right, so setting up the attributes for our pagination is done. Now, before we hit publish, there are a few other things that we need to do. Let's hop on to Wized. And the first thing that we want to do is set up the variables here. Starting off with the vfilter pagination next. So let's go to our actions here. And in the variables folder, I'm just going to grab this variable, duplicate it, filter, and instead of next current, I'm going to call it next. And then this is going to be set variable action. So request finishes, fetch cars, this is okay. Alrighty. So just to recap, what we did here is when the fetch car request finishes and it's successful, we target this data path right here, which has the value of the next page. We grab that value and we drop it into this variable right here. So let's reload this page one more time. There we go. So we have the pagination current value and we have the pagination next value too, which is perfect. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is let's revert back to our cars API request here. And now let's revise all the inputs that we have here and just make sure that we have everything that we need. So we have make, we have location, year, price from, price to, mileage from, mileage to. Now, we don't have, we have the current page. Actually, we don't have the current page on our request. So let's go ahead and set that up on the fetch cars request, connect that properly. So if I go to fetch cars, we have search, fuel type, make, price from, price to, mileage to, year, location, sort. So we have everything, but current page. So let's do that. So the current page input tells Xano which page data do we actually want? And this is going to be this variable right here. So v.filter pagination current. There we go. That is done. Now let's move back to Xano here. And then we have per page. So let's create a variable based off of this first before we can connect it to our request. So I'm going to call this filter items per page. And you can set, now this is going to be a static variable. This allows you to handle how many items would you like to load up every time. So by default, I'm just going to put in 50 here. So that's going to be the initial value, and that's going to be the only value. So let's go back to fetch cars. And let's actually double check this. So this is per page. So that way we tell Xano that, hey, we want to grab 50 items at a time. Okay, items per page. Now per page is done. And then I believe that is all. Now that we've grabbed, then let me just count all the inputs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So we got 12. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All right, so we got 12 inputs right here as well. And just like that, we have wrapped up on our cars, fetch cars request. And because we have done that, I'm going to go and duplicate this. Now this is going to be the request that's going to fetch the next batch. So I'm going to call it fetch cars next batch. Now everything in here is going to be the same, so we don't have to change anything. That's because we're making the call for the next batch to the same API. So we're going to grab the name for this, and we're going to go into our Webflow setup, double click into the pagination element, and now we're going to fill this out. Fetch cars next batch. And now lastly, we need to fill this out, wfilter result data path. So what this does is it tells our pagination element that when this request is successfully executed, we want to target this specific data path so that that contains all the data of the next batch, and then put it into our Wized variable, which is this one right here, and put that data into this variable. So now in order to get the data path, you need to go into Wized. Let's just launch this here, and this, all right, so this is working. Now the data path that you want to target, well, actually, let's do it from here. I think it's just easier. So it's not fetch cars. Okay, there we go. And we want to target this data path right here. Now, when you have pagination switched on Xano, you should have your data path look something like this: r.fetch, whatever your request name is, .data, and then .item. So basically, you're targeting the array with all the objects in it. So that's the one that you want to grab. So here is, all right, so I just grabbed it, r fetch cars next batch, data, cars, items. Now, that is pretty much it, I believe. So let's publish this and see if we run into any kind of issues. Let's, while this is publishing, let's also check our documentation. Those are pretty much all the attributes we need for our pagination. So hopefully this should work now. Okay, now it actually might not work, but before we actually test that out, there's another thing that we need to check off the list, and that is Wized filter pagination. So we have next set variable and then the current, but we actually need to make sure that we set up another another group of actions that updates these two variables. So let's select the current set variable and duplicate this. And instead of set variable, we're going to say update variable. And we want to update this variable here when fetch car's next batch is successful. So fetch car's next batch. Okay. So fetch cars, and then we want to grab the current page value from the next batch and update our variable so that our pagination can work properly. Hope this probably might not make sense right now, but as you see this in action, it will start to make sense. Now, we also want to make sure that the next variable has the same setup as well. So let's call it update variable. And we want to execute this on fetch car's next batch. Next batch. Alrighty. And just like that, we've wrapped up on this, and let's reload our page. So as you can see, we have executed fetch cars, which is great. And fetch car's next batch hasn't still been executed yet. But as soon as we get to the bottom of the page, we should be able to see something happening. You should see that this should get executed. And there you go. It just ran, and what it did was it grabbed the items from this data path, and then it pushed it straight into our variable, which is why we now have the old cards and the new cards as well. So if I scroll down again, it fetches the new items. If I scroll down again, it fetches the new items. Scroll down again, fetches the new items. Now, if you're wondering how many items is it fetching exactly? Now, if you remember correctly, we have this variable here, filter items per page. So it says 50. So it's grabbing 50 items at a time. So if I scroll all the way up here, I also set up the attributes here off screen, basically. I didn't record this, but yeah, it just shows you how many items have been rendered and how many items we have in total. Now, let's say that you have all these elements that are rendered out. You have this pagination here, which is great. But now you want to apply your filters. So what it does is when you select any filter, it just resets everything, because now you just have your content loaded up based off of what we have now, based on your filter criteria. So if you go all the way to the bottom, nothing happens because we only have one page worth of data based off of the filter that you've just selected. And that's the beauty of our entire filtering system. Let me go ahead and also set up the loader here so that you can see. So we need to grab this item here, filter item loader. So let's go over onto Wized, set up the attribute for this so it looks nicer when we have this set up. So I want this to be visible when r.fetchCars is requesting, or next batch is requesting. There we go. And the other thing that we want to also set up is this empty state. So let's grab the empty state. And we want to render this when our variable, which has all the data, so filter result length Did I do that right? Let me just double check that. Okay, so it worked. Let's reset that. And yeah, and we finally managed to successfully wrap up on our entire filtering system. That being said, if you go into your documentation here, you should be able to grab the Wized clonable, your Xano snippets, and the Webflow clonable as well, alongside with the entire documentation. Please keep in mind that this code that we're using is completely open source, so you can grab it off of GitHub repo as well. You'll find the link in the documentation as well. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me on the comments, or you can reach out to me as well. I also take consultations based off of any projects, aside from the filter setup as well. But yeah, feel free to reach out to me, and I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you and have a great day.